Authorities buried a place in sealed court records for over a century in the frozen hollows of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, where winter winds carry secrets through skeletal trees. In December 1862, 40 people from Holler Creek Valley walked through snowdrifts to the Bennington Sisters' private church of Final Salvation to pray for Christmas. After 3 weeks, when the blizzard stopped, Sheriff Josiah Weatherby found a deserted compound and 40 empty houses. People thought the story I was about to tell was too disturbing for the public to know, and investigators wouldn't talk about what they found hidden under the sisters' holy ground. These people weren't strangers. People loved Araminta and Cordelia Bennington as healers and trusted them with the deepest faith of the community. But what turned the daughters of 2 Methodist preachers into something so horrible that federal marshals kept the evidence secret for decades? What did they find in that compound that made experienced police officers burn the records? Justice was done, but the way it was done will make you question everything you thought you knew about God's mercy. Get ready for what's coming next, because this revelation will put your understanding of human evil to the test. If you're brave enough to go on this journey, subscribe so you don't miss stories that show the worst parts of human nature. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Sheriff Josiah Weatherby's hand shook as he read the dispatch from the 15th of January, 1863. Which was brought to him by a frostbitten writer from Holler Creek Valley. The message, which is still in the Missouri State Archives, had words that would stay with him for the rest of his life. 40 souls left for Christmas prayers at the Bennington Sisters Church on December 22nd. The storm cleared on January 10th. None came back home. Houses stand empty, and livestock are starving. The Union Army veteran had looked into disappearances on the frontier before, but never an entire community's worth of missing people. Weatherby quickly realized that this was more than just normal winter deaths, especially since the site was so far away from the nearest settlement, 15 miles away. During the harsh winter of 1860, the Bennington sisters came to Holler Creek Valley, looking like prayers that had been answered to a community that was having trouble with being alone and not getting enough medical care. Araminta, who was 32 years old, could recite Bible verses for hours without stopping. Cordelia, who was 27 years old, had real herbal healing knowledge that seemed miraculous to families on the frontier who were in need. Witnesses who spoke to Weatherby during his investigation said that their first impressions were very positive and that Cordelia's remedies seemed to cure long-term problems that had been bothering Valley residents for years. After Araminta's supposed vision experience, the sisters said they had received divine guidance. They told their neighbors that lightning had struck their old cabin, leaving her unconscious for 3 days before waking up and talking to God directly. Araminta's documented change began when she said she had received divine visions that told her to prepare souls for final judgment by purifying them. At first, people in the community thought this was just normal frontier evangelism, especially since they were Methodists and Araminta knew a lot about the Bible. However, Sheriff Weatherby's investigation notes, which are kept in county records, show that a number of residents began to voice private concerns about the sisters' increasingly extreme interpretations of Christian doctrine. Ezekiel Thorne, the valley's closest neighbor to the Bennington compound, testified that their property had been changed in strange ways, such as the construction of what looked like an unusually deep baptismal pool behind their main cabin. The first recorded death happened in March 1861, when 3-month-old Benjamin Friss died during what the sisters called a purification ceremony for innocent souls. Court records show that the parents were very upset when they testified that Araminta convinced them that their sickly baby needed to be completely immersed in blessed waters to wash away original sin before God's judgment. The child's death was officially listed as drowning, but Dr. Hinrich Mueller's autopsy notes, which were found years later, showed bruises that looked suspiciously like they were caused by being held down. The Riss family believed the sisters when they said that God called the pure child home before earthly corruption could take hold. However, other families began to privately question the need for such extreme baptismal practices. The second big red flag in the investigation was the disappearance of Martha Crenshaw in October 1861. According to Weatherby's detailed case files, the 7-year-old widow, who was well known in the valley for her midwifery skills and knowledge of herbs, had asked the sisters for help with her arthritis, which made it hard for her to take care of her home. Witnesses say that Martha was excited about the sisters' promise of divine healing through purification. She told her neighbors that she would go through a special blessing ceremony at their compound. After 3 days without hearing from her, worried neighbors found the sisters calmly working in their garden. They said that Martha had walked into the woods to join the angels after getting perfect healing. During the first searches, they never found her personal things, like her late husband's wedding ring and her grandmother's prayer book. The McGreedy family's tragedy in December 1861 made people in the community more scared than ever before. Sheriff Weatherby's investigation showed that the sisters had pulled off their most clever trick yet. James McCready, a skilled carpenter from Kentucky, brought his wife Sarah and their 5 kids to the valley to look for work as the Civil War was about to start. Court records show that Timothy McCready, who was 12 years old, went missing during what Araminta called a special blessing for young souls chosen by divine providence. Araminta said she saw the boy's body and spirit rise to heaven during prayer, and she said she saw him change into an angel. James McGreedy wanted to see his son's body so he could bury him properly, but the sisters said that the transformed body should leave no trace as flesh becomes spirit. Weatherby's investigation notes show a troubling trend that started in 1862. The sisters began to target the valley's most vulnerable residents, such as elderly people looking for medical help, families with sick children, and anyone who showed religious devotion. These people were invited to participate in purification ceremonies that promised miraculous healing through divine intervention. Witnesses who were interviewed during the investigation said that the community was becoming more and more uneasy, especially after several families said that their loved ones had gone to heaven after visiting the Bennington compound. But the sisters' charming religious authority and seeming theological knowledge still drew in people who were desperate for spiritual and physical healing. The meeting on the 22nd of December 1862 was the end of the sisters' 2-year campaign of religious manipulation and planned murder. Court records show that Araminta announced a special Christmas service of purification, saying that it would prepare 40 chosen souls for God's final judgment. Families in the valley got personal invitations, and the sisters said that God had told them who needed immediate spiritual cleansing. Ezekiel Thorne said that on that snowy night, he saw torchlight processions heading toward the compound and heard hymns echoing through the frozen forest. The blizzard that came after lasted 3 weeks, which was the perfect cover for the sisters' most terrible crimes. When Sheriff Weatherby finally got to the empty Bennington compound in January 1863, he found clues that would bother investigators for decades. The main cabin was empty, except for 2 sets of women's clothes laid out on beds as if they were ready to be buried, and personal items arranged on the kitchen table as if they were for a final ceremony. Weatherby felt a chill run through him when he read the note in Araminta's distinctive handwriting. The final cleansing is complete. The cursed shall not follow where angels tread. The compound was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the winter wind blowing through bare trees to break the silence. There were 40 souls who had walked through that door expecting divine salvation. On the 16th of January 1863, Sheriff Weatherby put together a search party of 12 men. Even though the temperature dropped below zero and snowdrifts reached 6 feet in the mountain passes leading to the Bennington compound. His official investigation notes, which are kept in the county archives, describe the dangerous 3-hour trip through frozen wilderness, where the group had to break trail through unmarked forest where 40 families had walked just weeks before. Deputy Marcus Henley's sworn testimony says that there was an eerie silence around the compound, which was only broken by the sound of axes chopping through the doors of cabins covered in ice. The main building looked like it had been sealed off from the inside on purpose, with furniture blocking windows and heavy wooden beams blocking the door from the inside, as if the people who lived there were getting ready for a siege. The search party's forced entry revealed the compound's first horrifying secret, which Weatherby had kept in a detailed evidence catalog. Along with the women's clothes and a strange goodbye note, investigators found that the cabin had been systematically changed in ways that suggested months of careful planning for mass murder. The court records show that all the furniture was taken out of the main room, leaving an open space that could hold a lot of people. The walls had new wooden crosses carved deep into the logs with what looked like knife blades. The most troubling thing was finding 43 individual prayer books on the floor, all open to Psalm 23 and marked with different names written in Araminta's unique handwriting. Deputy Henley's testimony talks about the time when the search party went behind the main cabin and found what would become the most damning physical evidence in the case: a huge baptismal pool, 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, had been dug out of the frozen ground and lined with stones that had been brought in from the creek bed nearby. Weatherby's official notes show that the structure took weeks of work to build and required engineering skills that were much more advanced than those needed for typical frontier baptismal facilities. Iron restraints, which looked like they were taken from old mining equipment, were bolted straight into the stone lining at depths that would put victims' heads well below the water level during any supposed religious ceremony. Ezekiel Thorne's important eyewitness testimony, given under oath in later court proceedings, gave investigators the timeline they needed to figure out how the sisters planned and carried out their mass murder. The neighbor who lived through it remembered seeing strange lights flickering and moving in patterns around the compound on several nights in December, along with what he thought at first was enthusiastic hymn singing. Court records keep Thorne's chilling memory of sounds that started out as normal church music but turned into screaming and women's voices chanting Bible verses. His written account of seeing smoke coming from the compound's chimney during the 3-week blizzard showed that people were still living there, which went against the sisters' claim that they left right after their last service. The search party's investigation of the cabin's root cellar turned up evidence that would be very important in figuring out who each victim was and how the sisters collected trophies from their crimes. Weatherby's inventory, which was carefully recorded in county records, listed 43 mason jars on wooden shelves. Each jar had a victim's name on it and held personal items that families would later recognize as belonging to their missing loved ones. Martha Crenshaw's jar had her wedding ring and glasses in it, and Timothy McCrady's jar had his wooden toy soldier and a lock of hair tied with blue ribbon in it. The way this collection was put together showed that the sisters had thought about it ahead of time and that they saw their victims' things as holy relics of their sick religious mission. Investigators found a leather-bound diary with detailed accounts of each murder that had taken place in the previous 2 years, hidden under loose floorboards in what looked like Cordelia's private sleeping area. Weatherby's notes say that they found the journal wrapped in oiled cloth and buried with Cordelia's personal things. This shows that Cordelia knew that her writings contained evidence that could be used against her and needed to be hidden. The diary's pages, written in neat feminine script, gave prosecutors written confessions that would be hard to argue with in court. Each entry carefully noted the victim's name, the date of their purification, and disturbing details about their last moments during drowning ceremonies. The diary's most damning entry, from the 22nd of December 1862, showed that the sisters had carefully planned their biggest mass murder and gave investigators direct proof that they had planned to kill people on purpose, not by accident, during religious ceremonies. Cordelia's neat handwriting recorded, "The Lord has blessed us with 40 souls ready for final cleansing." Araminta says, "The pool water must be blessed with iron and stone to ensure the flesh cannot escape before the spirit ascends. The restraints must hold firm during transformation, as earthly bodies resist heavenly calling." This entry alone gave prosecutors written proof that the sisters knew their victims would fight against drowning and had made mechanical means to stop them from escaping. Weatherby's team found more diary entries that showed how the mental health of 2 frontier healers had gotten worse, turning them into cold-blooded killers driven by religious delusion. Cordelia wrote about how Araminta was becoming more and more sure that she could see angels waiting to receive purified souls. She also wrote about how she was sure that drowning victims transformed before my eyes, as their earthly screaming gave way to celestial song. Court records kept testimony showing that these journal entries showed that the sisters were completely out of touch with reality, but still had enough mental capacity to plan and carry out complicated criminal operations over a long period of time. The search party's last and most terrible find was when Deputy Henley saw that the stone bottom of the baptismal pool looked disturbed under a thin layer of ice. Weatherby's official report says that they used axes and shovels to break through the frozen ground under the pool's foundation, which led to the discovery of a mass grave with 43 bodies in different states of preservation. Dr. Hinrich Mueller's later autopsy findings, which were recorded in court records, showed that every victim had drowned. There were clear signs of restraint on their wrists and ankles that matched the iron fixtures found bolted inside the pool. The way the bodies were stacked, with quicklime and stones on top, showed that they were deliberately disposed of in a way that would hide evidence and keep it from being found. The victims' bodies showed investigators without a doubt that the Bennington sisters had killed them on purpose, not by doing religious ceremonies that accidentally killed them. Mueller's medical examination, which was recorded in trial transcripts, showed defensive wounds on the hands and arms of several victims, which meant that they were fighting against their restraints while they were drowning. Victims' broken fingernails and tissue samples found under their nails had wood pieces that matched the baptismal pool's restraint system, showing that they were trying to get away. The worst thing that happened was that some of the victims, like elderly Martha Crenshaw and young Timothy McCready, were found with stones tied to their clothes, which made it impossible for them to come up, even if they had broken free from the iron restraints. On the 3rd of February 1863, Federal Marshal Thomas Clayton arrived in Holler Creek Valley after Sheriff Weatherby's telegraphed report reached the authorities in Missouri. The report said that 43 bodies had been found and that there was evidence of systematic mass murder. Clayton's official letter, which is kept in federal archives, said that the Bennington case needed immediate federal action because the crime was too big for local authorities to handle and it was important to stop similar crimes from happening in other remote areas. The Marshal's first-hand experience with religious extremist groups during the Second Great Awakening made him the best person to understand how the sisters used psychological manipulation. The first thing he did when he got to the compound was to take Cordelia's diary as federal evidence, knowing that her detailed confessions would give prosecutors proof of premeditated murder that couldn't be denied. Clayton's study of the diary entries showed how the sisters' twisted theology changed over time, starting with real Methodist beliefs and ending with a religion that justified mass murder as divine mercy. Court records show his testimony about how Cordelia's early writings showed normal frontier religious concerns about salvation and the welfare of the community. However, entries from after Araminta's lightning strike incident showed increasingly crazy interpretations of biblical scripture. The Marshal's psychological profile, which was sent to federal prosecutors, showed that the sisters were suffering from a shared religious delusion and planned crimes in a calculated way. Clayton was most upset to find that the diary had detailed drawings of how the modified baptismal pool was built, including exact measurements for the restraint system and notes on the best water depth to keep victims from escaping. The diary's religious reasons gave federal investigators a never-before-seen look at how the sisters' mental health had completely broken down and how they had turned Christian teachings into a murder manual. Cordelia's entry from September 1862 showed that they thought the Civil War was God's last judgment on America, and that they needed to prepare chosen souls through baptism to survive the coming apocalypse. Court records keep her written explanation that drowning people in blessed water would turn their bodies into angelic warriors for God's army. Clayton's analysis said that this delusion let the sisters see mass murder as an act of divine mercy that saved victims from eternal damnation by forcing them to change their spiritual state. Federal investigators found physical evidence that showed the sisters had carefully planned how to build their killing machines. This showed that their planning was too advanced to support any claims that their actions were religious accidents or acts of religious fervor. Clayton's technical examination, which is recorded in court records, found a complicated pulley system above the baptismal pool that was meant to keep victims underwater while the sisters prayed for their cleansing. Iron weights, which looked like they were taken from old mining operations, were chained to the pulleys and could be lowered onto the chests of people who were drowning to keep them from coming up. The Marshal's measurements showed that the system could handle more than one drowning at a time. This explains how the sisters were able to kill 40 people during their last ceremony in December. Diary entries that talk about Cordelia's personal responsibility for holding each victim down during the drowning process show that she was God's midwife for rebirth. Federal court records keep her written confession, which describes how she helped each soul move from earthly death to heavenly transformation by holding victims under the blessed water until they stopped struggling and angelic peace appeared in their eyes. Clayton's Offen's psychological analysis found that Cordelia was the methodical partner who put Araminta's religious visions into action by figuring out the right water temperature, restraint position, and timing needed to make sure death happened while still looking like a religious ceremony. The sisters were able to make a killing machine look like baptismal equipment because of her engineering background, which she got from her father's work building mills. The most disturbing thing the investigation found out about religious delusion's ability to justify systematic murder was Araminta's documented change into the self-proclaimed angel of final judgment. Clayton's examination of diary entries disclosed Araminta's unwavering conviction in her divine mandate to discern which souls necessitated purification for salvation, with her choices grounded in perceived spiritual frailty rather than any valid religious standards. Court records keep her written theology, which says that screaming on earth during purification means that the flesh is resisting salvation, while silence means that the angels have successfully changed. The marshal's psychological profile showed that Araminta had a messianic complex and was psychopathic, which meant she was able to see victims' fear and pain as spiritual signs that God approved of murder. The federal investigation's timeline showed that the sisters' murders got worse over the course of 2 years, starting with opportunistic killings of weak people and ending with planned mass murders of whole families. Clayton's collection of evidence, which is still available in court documents, showed that the sisters first went after people who lived alone and whose disappearances could be explained by dangers on the frontier, such as attacks by wild animals or bad weather. But as they became more sure that the community would accept their religious authority, they committed bolder murders, including the deaths of whole families whose simultaneous disappearances needed complicated theological explanations. The marshal's analysis showed that the sisters' mass killing in December 1862 was the last time they showed how twisted their religious mission was. They were trying to cleanse almost the whole valley population before they left. The most heartbreaking evidence in the investigation came from Cordelia's detailed account of the murder of 3-year-old Sarah Crenshaw, which she wrote down in her diary in a cold, clinical way that shocked even the most experienced federal investigators. Court records keep her entry from the 23rd of December, 1862. Little Sarah Crenshaw fought the longest, but Araminta held her under until the bubbles stopped. God demanded complete surrender. We dressed her in white after, like the angel she became. Clayton's testimony said that this passage showed how morally corrupt the sisters had become, showing that they were able to kill children and still believe they were doing the right thing. The marshal's psychological analysis said that Cordelia's matter-of-fact description of killing a child, along with her mention of dressing the body after death, showed that she was a psychopath who was hiding her true feelings behind religious delusion. In March 1863, federal tracking efforts stepped up when local hunters said they saw smoke coming from caves in the mountain system, which was 20 miles northeast of the abandoned compound. Clayton's search team found proof that people had recently lived there, such as food caches, religious items, and, most worryingly, a natural spring that the sisters had turned into another baptismal pool with rocks and wooden restraints. Witnesses from the hunting party said they heard women's voices chanting and screaming coming from deep inside the cave system, along with splashing sounds that made it sound like there were water ceremonies going on. The marshal's tactical assessment showed that the sisters were trying to finish their religious mission by purifying themselves. They thought they had to die in order to join their converted angels in God's army. The last fight happened on the 28th of March, 1863, when Clayton's federal team, along with Sheriff Weatherby and local deputies, surrounded the cave entrance and found the Bennington sisters near death from exposure and repeated attempts to drown themselves. Court records show that both women were partially submerged in their makeshift baptismal pool, with Araminta holding Cordelia's head underwater while reading Bible verses about spiritual change. Medical reports said that the sisters had severe hypothermia and injuries from being in water for a long time. This showed that they had been trying to drown themselves for several days while still holding their twisted religious ceremonies. The report on Clayton's arrest said that both women were still awake enough to say they were unhappy about not being able to join our angels. This showed that they were completely committed to their murderous, religious delusion, even to death. The arrest of the Bennington sisters by Federal Marshal Clayton on the 28th of March, 1863, started the longest and most thorough questioning process in Missouri's territorial history. Both women needed medical attention right away before questioning could start. Court records show that Araminta and Cordelia were taken to Springfield with a lot of guards. They were so cold that they needed 3 days of medical care before Marshal Clayton thought they were well enough to give clear testimony. Dr. Hinrich Mueller's medical examination, which is still available in federal archives, showed that both sisters had injuries that they had caused themselves that were consistent with trying to drown themselves multiple times. These injuries included waterlogged lungs and rope burns around their necks from makeshift restraints. Clayton was most upset to learn that the sisters had carved Bible verses into their own skin with sharp stones, which made infected wounds that spelled out things like "angels await" and "divine purification complete." On the 1st of April, 1863, Araminta was formally questioned. Federal stenographers wrote down every word of her detailed confessions, which would give prosecutors proof of premeditated mass murder. Clayton's questioning strategy, which is recorded in court transcripts, involved letting Araminta explain her crimes in her own religious terms. This was because her religious delusions made her feel like she had to justify each killing by interpreting the Bible. Her recorded testimony, which is kept in federal archives, gave a terrifying look at how each murder was planned. The Lord revealed that Martha Crenshaw's arthritis was earthly punishment, requiring spiritual cleansing through holy drowning. I held her beneath the blessed waters until her struggling ceased, knowing her screams were flesh resisting salvation. The marshal's psychological assessment said that Araminta showed no remorse, but instead was angry that her divine mission had been interrupted before it was finished. During the sisters' arrest, police found physical evidence in the cave system, such as detailed murder plans written in Araminta's unique handwriting. This gave prosecutors documented proof that the murders were planned ahead of time and not just acts of religious zeal. Federal investigators found 43 separate murder plans, each with criteria for choosing victims, the best ways to drown them, and religious reasons for the planned killings. Court records keep Araminta's written orders for the mass murder in December 1862. 40 souls shall be purified at the same time to show God's power. The restraint system must hold firm during collective transformation. Cordelia will manage the weights while I say final prayers over struggling flesh. Clayton's analysis showed that these plans showed a complex criminal organization posing as a religious ceremony, with backup plans in case victims tried to escape or community members got in the way. The most damning physical evidence came from finding architectural sketches drawn by Araminta that showed not only the compound's baptismal pool, but also detailed plans for a similar killing machine at other frontier locations. Federal court records keep her drawings of churches of final salvation that were supposed to be built in remote areas of Missouri, Arkansas, and the Indian Territory. Each church would have the same restraint systems that were meant to make mass drowning more efficient. Clayton's investigation showed that the sisters had written to other frontier preachers to promote their purification ministry and offer to set up satellite churches all over the area. One preserved letter, sent to Reverend Ezekiel Morrison in Arkansas, had Araminta's religious explanation. God commands the purification ministry to grow in order to get chosen souls ready for final judgment. Each community needs baptismal facilities that can turn many earthly forms into angelic warriors. During the sisters' interrogation, Dr. Mueller wrote detailed autopsy reports that gave federal prosecutors medical proof that all 43 victims had died from being forced to drown while being violently restrained. His documented findings, which are still in court records, showed that all of the victims had the same types of injuries, such as marks on their wrists and ankles from being restrained, wounds on their hands and forearms from defending themselves, and tissue damage that showed they had been fighting against mechanical restraints for a long time. Mueller's most terrifying discovery was that stones sewn into the clothing of several victims, including children, had been used to keep them from escaping during drowning ceremonies. The doctor's testimony backed up the sisters' claims that they were going through a peaceful spiritual change, but the physical evidence showed that they were fighting against their restraints in a desperate and violent way. The sisters' preserved letters to other religious leaders showed how big their planned expansion really was. What had been isolated murders became a possible network of killing operations across the frontier that were disguised as spiritual services. Federal investigators found letters from 14 different frontier preachers who were interested in the Benningtons' methods of purification and asked for detailed instructions on how to set up similar ministries in their own communities. Clayton's analysis, which is recorded in court records, showed that the sisters saw their murders in Holler Creek Valley as a successful model for getting rid of spiritually weak frontier populations in a systematic way. In one letter from Cordelia to Reverend Thomas Whitman in the Indian Territory, she gave clear instructions. Baptismal pools must be dug to a depth of 8 feet, and iron restraint systems must be bolted into stone foundations. Victims must be individually assessed theologically before purification to make sure that God approves of their earthly transformation. 3 days after her arrest, prosecutors found Araminta's written confession hidden in her cell mattress. It was the most complete record of premeditated murder ever found in federal territorial courts. The National Archives has a 40-page document that lists every murder that happened between 1861 and 1863, along with the criteria for choosing victims, the methods used, and the religious reasons given for each death. Court records keep her chilling account of the December mass murder. God blessed us with 40 souls that needed to be purified right away before the war's final judgment. Each victim was held under blessed waters until their earthly screams turned into heavenly silence. Their flesh resisted salvation, but divine will prevailed through iron restraints and weighted garments. Clayton's psychological evaluation said that Araminta's confession showed that she was completely detached from her victims' humanity, while still remembering their suffering in detail. The federal trial that began on the 15th of April, 1863, had so much physical evidence, written confessions, and eyewitness testimony that there was no way for the Bennington sisters to defend themselves against the systematic murder campaign they were running. Court records show that federal prosecutors brought 43 different murder charges. Each charge was backed up by Cordelia's diary entries, Araminta's written confessions, physical evidence from the victims' remains, and plans for more killing operations. The federal court-appointed defense attorneys tried to use religious delusion as a reason for leniency, but Clayton's testimony about the sisters' detailed planning and communication with other possible killers showed that they were acting with clear criminal intent rather than religious mania. The recorded statements of Judge Harrison Blackwood showed that the case was an unprecedented evil disguised as divine service, and that the federal government needed to do everything it could to stop similar crimes from happening again. Throughout the trial, both sisters were completely defiant. They refused to admit to any wrongdoing and continued to claim that they were following God's orders to kill people. They also said they would be happy to return to their purification ministry if they were released. During cross-examination, court stenographers recorded Araminta's testimony. "Every soul we cleansed rose as an angel to serve in God's army. Their earthly screaming was flesh-resisting salvation, but we delivered them from eternal damnation through holy drowning." Cordelia's recorded statements showed the same psychological conviction, describing each victim's death as beautiful spiritual transformation witnessed through divine eyes. Clayton's final assessment, preserved in court records, concluded that both sisters remained completely unrepentant and would resume killing if given any opportunity, making them permanent threats to any community that might harbor them. Despite the ongoing battles of the Civil War that had made it hard for civilians to go to court in the territory, the trial of Araminta and Cordelia Bennington began on the 8th of May, 1863, in the federal courthouse in Springfield, Missouri. In his opening statement, Judge Harrison Blackwood, whose words are still in court records, said that prosecuting 43 counts of first-degree murder during wartime conditions was unprecedented. However, he stressed that the systematic killing of innocent civilians needs immediate federal justice, no matter what the military situation is. James Morrison, the federal prosecutor, brought in evidence that filled 6 tables in the courtroom. This evidence included Cordelia's full diary, Araminta's written confessions, architectural plans for bigger killing operations, and letters from other frontier preachers who were interested in their purification ministry. More than 200 people came to the first day of the trial, many of whom traveled from nearby counties to see justice done against the most prolific murderers in Missouri's territorial history. Rebecca Crenshaw's testimony on May 10th gave the court devastating personal impact evidence that turned statistical murder charges into human tragedy that needed the harshest legal punishment. Court transcripts show that she identified 7 family members among the remains that were found, including her elderly parents and 2 young nieces. The sisters' warped beliefs cut short the lives of these people. Her detailed account of finding her mother's prayer book and her father's wedding ring among the sisters' trophies was proof that the people who did it were connected to specific victims. Rebecca's testimony about how her family had a desperate faith in the sisters' healing promises was the most damaging. It showed how the Benningtons used religious trust to make systematic murder easier. Judge Blackwood's notes said that Rebecca's emotional testimony made some jurors cry, but the defendants didn't show any emotion at all and stared at the ceiling of the courtroom as if they were getting messages from God. The third day of the trial was all about Dr. Heinrich Mueller's medical testimony. His detailed autopsy findings gave scientific proof that each victim died from violent, planned drowning and not by accident during a religious ceremony. Court records show exactly how he documented restraint marks, defensive wounds, and physical evidence of desperate attempts to escape from mechanical restraints. His testimony about the weighted clothing sewn to the victims' bodies was especially damaging because it showed that he had planned to make sure they drowned even if they managed to break free from the iron restraints. Mueller's examination of the children's remains was the most terrifying. It showed that even the youngest victims had been systematically restrained and weighted, which went against any possible claim of merciful religious transformation. The doctor never lost his professional calm, even when he talked about evidence that made people in the courtroom gasp in horror. The last piece of evidence for the prosecution came from Ezekiel Thorne's eyewitness testimony on May 12th. It showed that the sisters had been lying to their community for more than 2 years in a systematic way. Court records show that he gave a detailed account of seeing 40 neighbors walk toward the Bennington compound on December 22nd. He also described how the hymns turned into screams that went on all night. His testimony about how calm the sisters were when they talked about the victims' disappearances showed that they were manipulating people's trust in a calculated way. Thorne's description of seeing smoke rising from the compound during the 3-week blizzard was the most damning evidence against the sisters. It showed that they were still at their property during the time they said they had left for heavenly realms with their victims. Judge Blackwood's questioning showed that Thorne's wife was the only reason he lived, because she didn't trust the sisters' extreme religious practices. On May 15, the defense's last argument tried to paint the sisters as victims of religious delusion instead of cold-blooded killers. However, federal prosecutor Morrison's rebuttal systematically destroyed any chance of leniency based on mental illness claims. Court records show Morrison's presentation of the sisters' architectural plans for expanding their killing operations, their letters to other possible accomplices, and their methodical trophy collection as proof of criminal sophistication that is not compatible with legal insanity. His closing argument stressed that religious delusion could not justify the planned murder of 43 innocent people, especially when there were already plans in place to set up similar killing operations across the frontier. In their last statement, which was recorded in court transcripts, the prosecutor said, "Divine justice demands earthly punishment for those who pervert sacred scripture to justify systematic slaughter of the faithful." Judge Blackwood made it clear to the jury that being religious could not lessen the legal consequences of planning a mass murder. On May 16th, the jury only took 4 hours to reach a decision. They found both defendants guilty on all 43 counts of first-degree murder. Court records show that some jurors cried as they read their verdicts because they were so upset by the evidence of systematic murder disguised as a religious ceremony. Judge Blackwood's sentencing statement, which is kept in legal archives, called the sisters wolves in sheep's clothing who perverted sacred trust to feed their bloodlust. He also said that their complete lack of remorse showed that they were a permanent threat to any community. The death sentences, which were to be carried out by hanging as required by federal territorial law, were set for the 15th of June, 1863. This gave the defendants very little time to appeal because the evidence of their guilt was so strong. Both sisters seemed happy with their sentences. Araminta even thanked God out loud for letting earthly authorities expedite our reunion with our angels. The community's reaction to the death sentences showed an unprecedented level of support for each other on the frontier. Survivors from Holler Creek Valley worked together to make sure that family members of all the victims would be present at the sisters' execution. Court records show that Rebecca Crenshaw was the official family representative and testified that the executions were necessary to stop other crimes from happening and restore people's faith in the justice system. Sheriff Weatherby's official report said that more than 300 people, including survivors, law enforcement officers, and federal officials in charge of stopping similar religious extremist violence, were there to see the hanging on June 15. The sisters' last words, which were written down by court reporters, showed that they were still defying the law and were fully mentally committed to their violent religion. "You silence God's servants, but our angels await your judgment," Araminta said. Cordelia then said, "Divine retribution will fall upon those who prevent holy purification." After the executions, people in Holler Creek Valley took extreme steps to make sure that the Bennington compound would never again be a place where religious extremists could hurt people. Community records show that all of the sisters' buildings were burned down in a planned way, and then stones from the nearby forest were used to fill their baptismal pool. The site was left unmarked on purpose, and the families of the victims agreed that no memorial to the people who did it should be visible to future generations. The most important thing the community did was put up individual stone markers in Holler Creek Cemetery for each of the 43 victims. This way, their names would be remembered while their killers would be remembered as criminals in history. Federal authorities kept all of the physical evidence, like Cordelia's diary and architectural plans, in Missouri State Archives as proof of religious extremist violence and a warning to future law enforcement officials. The Bennington sisters case set important legal precedents for prosecuting religious extremist violence and protecting small, isolated communities on the frontier from charismatic predators who pose as spiritual leaders. Modern historical analysis corroborates that Sheriff Weatherby's tenacity, Federal Marshal Clayton's inquiry, and Dr. Antonek's time. Mueller's scientific documentation produced the extensive evidence requisite for expeditious justice and the deterrence of copycat offenses. The preserved court records are still used by police as a case study in how to spot and punish religious extremist violence. The memorial to the victims in Holler Creek Cemetery honors their memory as innocent people whose faith was twisted. In the end, divine justice didn't come from the sisters' twisted prayers. It came from the hard work of dedicated lawmen and the weight of proof that made sure evil was exposed, prosecuted, and silenced for good.